It was kind of a crazy time in Israel, you know. We're talking about the ancient days when having a king was still a novelty, and this king was Saul. He wasn't that humble, handsome young man the people had cheered for in the beginning anymore. Now, the guy was a deep well of paranoia and jealousy. His life revolved around hearing whispers in the palace and looking sideways at anyone who seemed too popular, especially after that kid, David, started becoming the sensation. Saul walked around. With his soul in shreds, always feeling threatened, as if the crown might slip off his head at any moment. The palace, which should have been a place of royal peace, had turned into a nest of tension, and every smile from a subordinate seemed to hide a knife about to be plunged into his back. On that specific day, a dense fog of suspicion covered even the king's breakfast, and he woke up with his heart already pounding, sensing that something big and terrible was about to happen. And in the middle of Saul's mental chaos, there was a guy named Abner. Think of a highly respected general, tall, with a thick beard, with the bearing of someone who had seen 1,000 battles and won them all. Abner was the commander-in-chief of the Israelite army, a striking figure, much more than a soldier. He was practically a symbol for the northern tribes, a war hero. He, poor guy, was trying to balance the scale between loyalty to the king, who was going completely mad, and reason, which said, things were going down the drain. The problem was that in Saul's heart, Abner's brilliance was an insult, a silent threat to his wavering power. That morning, Abner had left very early for a routine inspection, oblivious to the poisonous whirlwind forming in the king's mind. The sun was rising, painting the desert in orange hues, but Saul's mind only saw conspiratorial shadows, and Abner's name was right in the center of that internal storm. The conspiracy, or rather, the invention of it, took shape in Saul's feverish head through some fake reports planted by some officers who were just royal sycophants, people who wanted to see Abner out of the way to climb the ranks. It was said that Abner was secretly negotiating with David's supporters, planning a large-scale betrayal. The truth, the omnipresent narrator knew, was that Abner was loyal, but that didn't matter to the royal paranoia. Saul didn't stop to think, didn't ask advice from anyone worthwhile, not even the Urim and Thummim. Nor did he pray. He simply exploded. The wrath was so sudden and blind that it seemed like a lightning bolt on a cloudless day. He clenched his fists on the cedar table, and the veins in his neck looked like ropes ready to snap. In that instant, jealousy had mixed with fear, creating an explosive cocktail of royal vengeance that demanded blood. The king then called the most loyal officers, or were they the most opportunistic, to the darkest room in the palace. The order came out of his mouth. Like cold poison, a secret and shocking thing. Abner and his family were to be executed. The excuse would be an urgent military meeting, the reality, a mass murder. Saul was acting in the urgency of hatred, wanting to sweep the threat away once and for all, leaving no traces or witnesses to tell the story of his tyranny. His face, usually pale, was red and sweaty, and his eyes, deep-set and bloodshot, showed that there was no more reason there, only the insatiable thirst to feel secure through the extermination of those he saw as rivals. The order was given with such certainty of impunity that the executioners felt a chill down their spine, knowing they were about to commit one of the kingdom's greatest atrocities. What Saul failed to consider in his raging fury was the magnitude of the disaster he was about to unleash. Abner wasn't just a general. He was a pillar supporting the kingdom. Executing him would be like blowing up the bridge between the northern tribes and Saul's throne. It would be seen as a tyrannical act, an injustice that would forever stain the king's name, and the immediate result would be a civil war that would cause Israel to bleed irreparably. That was exactly what common sense, and even David, his rival, were trying to prevent: the division of the people. But hate is stupid, right? And Saul was completely blind to the consequences, focused only on the momentary relief that vengeance promised to bring. The fate of the entire kingdom hung by a thread. And that thread was the madness of a bitter king, about to be severed by the blade of execution. But thanks to God, or to chance, whichever you prefer, the news leaked. One of the servants, a discreet guy with a loyalty that went beyond the crown and reached what was just, managed to intercept the royal message. He knew that this was a point of no return. And who did he run to? To the only authority that still held some moral weight over Saul: Samuel, the old prophet who had anointed the king. And watched him crumble, was living a more reclusive life, but justice and the good of Israel were still his cause. The servant arrived panting, eyes wide, and the news exploded in the quiet of Samuel's house like thunder. The prophet, even with the weight of age and the fatigue of years dealing with human stubbornness, did not hesitate. He felt deep down that this was the crucial moment, the final test of his mission. Samuel hurried like lightning, but with the calmness of one carrying the weight of spiritual authority. He didn't need an army nor a sword, just the word. He arrived at the palace at the exact moment the executioners, tense and already with weapons ready, were preparing to leave and carry out the nefarious order. The scene was tense. The darkness of the room contrasted with the haste and morbid excitement of the officers. When Samuel burst in, he didn't shout. He merely stopped, imposing, and his presence filled the environment. The worn, yet dignified mantle seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Saul, upon seeing him, stopped dead. It was like seeing his own past, his lost conscience, materialized before him. The old prophet, the voice of God, was the last person he wanted to see in that moment of blind vengeance. The confrontation was not physical, it was a battle of wills and memories. Samuel gazed at Saul with those ancient eyes, which seemed to see through the king's armor and touch his tormented soul. He did not begin with threats or condemnations about the future, which would have made Saul harden. Instead, he brought him back to the first mistake, that crucial moment when Saul disobeyed God and lost the moral right to the throne. It was a low blow, straight to the king's ego. Samuel's voice was grave and firm, but loaded with a deep sadness, as if mourning a lost son. He reminded Saul of his youth, of the humility that had led him to the throne, contrasting it with the bloodthirsty paranoia of that moment. The prophet was confronting the king with the story of his own downfall, and then Samuel, with surgical precision, threw the prophecy in Saul's face right there in front of the execution officers. He said, without raising his voice, that shedding the innocent blood of Abner, a loyal servant and war hero, motivated only by jealousy and paranoia, was not just a crime, but a seal. It would be the final seal on the end of his reign, and in a dishonorable way, much worse than any civil war. Samuel appealed to something that still survived in Saul's core, the fear of God and the dread of a greater curse that would extend over his entire house, over his children. He didn't speak of David, no. He focused on divine justice. This touched a deeper wound in Saul than the threat of losing the kingdom, because he knew that dishonor was the worst fate for a king. Samuel's moral authority was palpable, weighing more than 1,000 swords. In that moment, in the gloomy palace, prophetic wisdom imposed itself over the king's blind, vengeful impulse. The scene was electrifying. The executioners stood still, tense, watching the duel of glances and wills. Samuel's prophecy, loaded with truths that Saul could not deny, broke the king's murderous momentum. It was as if the fog of his paranoia had dissipated for an instant, and he saw himself from the outside, a pathetic man about to destroy everything due to unfounded fear. The air Saul breathed seemed heavy, dense, and he felt a wave of nausea because of what he was about to do. In that instant of agonizing lucidity, Saul saw himself completely exposed. He was humiliated, not by the prophet's words, but by the truth of them. The silence in the room was so dense, you could hear the grinding of the guard's sandals outside. The king, with a slow and trembling movement of his hand, revoked the order of execution. It was an almost inaudible whisper, but it reverberated in the souls of the officers and in the heart of the omnipresent narrator who felt the relief. The vengeance was interrupted. Abner, miles away, continued his inspection, totally unaware of the fact that in one moment his life and that of his family had been mere seconds from being cut short. Samuel's intervention not only saved Abner, but temporarily preserved the unity of Israel. Saul sat down, breathless, with his hands covering his face, overcome by conscience. He didn't ask for forgiveness, nor did he thank Samuel. He merely shrank into his own misery. The prophet's voice, which sounded like the voice of a more decent past, had prevented the king from committing the most destructive and dishonorable act of his reign. Samuel then simply left, without another word, leaving Saul alone with the weight of his near destruction. The prophet knew the king was not cured, but the crisis had been averted. The day went on, with the sun already high, and the palace routine tried to return to normal. But the shadow of what almost happened hung over everyone. Saul could not eat that day, and the smell of the palace's fine food caused him repulsion. He spent the whole day brooding, feeling the humiliation of having been exposed and prevented, without, however, learning the most important lesson. The experience of that day was etched into Saul's memory like a cold burn. A constant reminder that there was an authority that surpassed his, a power that could curb even his most destructive fury. He tried, in the days that followed, to act as if nothing had happened. But the dread he felt seeing Samuel there in that moment did not leave him. His officers, who witnessed the scene, kept silent, but respect for Samuel and suspicion regarding the king's sanity deepened. That day was a turning point, proof that moral authority can indeed break the impulse of tyranny. Abner, in turn, returned to the palace at the end of the day, tired from the journey, and noticed nothing different. The general did not know that he had been the involuntary protagonist of a life or death drama. He merely reported to the king, who received him with a forced coldness and evasive eyes. Saul couldn't look Abner in the eyes, feeling like a coward inside. But his paranoia, although shaken, had not disappeared. The king only managed to give a mundane order and dismiss the general quickly. And so, life went on, with the king more tormented than ever, and the general, unaware that his life had been saved by the voice of an old prophet, remained loyal, unconscious of the subtle miracle that had occurred that day. Vengeance was averted, but Saul's heart remained a minefield. Night fell, and with it, the darkness brought back the whirlwind of Saul's thoughts. He lay down, but sleep would not come. The image of Samuel, standing at the door, with that look of deep disappointment, repeated itself in his mind like a bad movie. He felt the oppression of guilt, not for wanting to kill Abner, but for having been prevented, for having been exposed in his weakness and madness. The king tossed and turned in the silk bed, feeling suffocated by his own fear. He got up and went to the balcony. The cold night breeze did not relieve the heat of his soul. He looked at the starry sky and felt small, a speck of dust. The grandeur of the universe only served to increase his feeling of isolation. He knew, deep down, that he had lost the connection with something greater a long time ago, and Samuel's intervention was merely proof that this separation was irrevocable. That day ended with Saul more king and at the same time less man than ever. From that day on, Abner remained alive and active, but the atmosphere in the palace changed subtly but perceptibly. Saul continued to be Saul, but his madness took on a new, more cynical layer. He had learned that vengeance could be interrupted by collective conscience and the weight of moral authority, but he did not abandon the idea that everyone was against him. He just became more cautious, more calculating. The king began to observe Abner even more intensely, looking for the slightest slip, the smallest proof of treason, but he never again dared to give such a hasty order for execution. The memory of the prophet at the door served as a kind of phantom brake, a constant reminder that he was being watched by forces he could not control. That day, although it seemed to have ended in nothing happened, was, in fact, one of the most important days of his reign, a watershed between total insanity and a minimum of restraint. Abner continued to do his job, unaware of the shadow of death that hung over his head. He lived his life loyal to the kingdom, and his ignorance was, ironically, his greatest protection. He never knew that the fear of a divine curse, and not Saul's goodness, had saved his life. Real life often happens behind the scenes, with mysterious interventions that the protagonists never fully come to understand. And for us, who are observing all this, there remains the feeling of astonishment and the certainty that life is full of moments like this, where an invisible force, a word at the right time, or even an ancient fear can change the course of history and save someone from a terrible fate. The confrontation that day had no swords, but it was Saul's greatest battle, and he lost not to an army, but to the voice of truth that he had tried to silence for so long. Saul's story didn't end there, of course, but that specific day, the day Samuel stopped him, remained a question mark in the history of his decline. It was a moment of forced reverence, a pause in the madness that ultimately only postponed the inevitable, but saved an innocent man from an unjust death and the kingdom from immediate dismemberment. And so, the day faded away, leaving behind only the bitter taste of the near tragedy and the aura of mystery of the prophetic intervention. Time passed, but for Saul the feeling was that the day had not ended. Samuel's intervention hung over him like a dark cloud, not of rain, but of irrefutable authority. The king tried to convince himself that he had revoked the order for strategic reasons, not to start the civil war, but deep down he knew that the prophet's voice had cut off his breath. He felt a strange tingling in his chest every time he thought about the matter, a sensation that mixed the humiliation of being caught in the act and the terrifying relief of not having stained his hands with a blood that he knew would have been his. Immediate ruin. The palace remained luxurious, but for Saul it had become a velvet prison, where even the tastiest food tasted like ashes because of the disturbing memory of that moment. And this memory was not just mental, it was physical. Whenever the king approached a window overlooking the courtyard where the executioners had gathered, he felt a chill that did not come from the wind. It was as if the air in that place was frozen in time, with the energy of the unfulfilled order. He tried to avoid the area, walked through longer corridors, but the atmosphere of reverence and fear followed him. The way his loyal officers looked at him also changed. There was a cautious respect, mixed with a disguised dread that the madness could return at any moment. Saul felt like a dormant volcano, and he hated the prophet Samuel for giving him a pause button, stripping him of total control over his own destruction. What bothered Saul the most, and the narrator could feel this with the cold, certainty of one who reads the soul, was Samuel's post-confrontation silence. The prophet had not made a scene, had not summoned a crowd, nor even threatened future punishment at the time. He simply exposed the truth of the king's heart and withdrew, letting the truth do the dirty work. This attitude, so mysterious and restrained, was 1,000 times more terrifying for Saul than if Samuel had brought an army. The king spent hours in the throne room, looking at the solid stone walls, trying to decipher the real meaning of that intervention. He wondered, did Samuel know everything? If he knew, why did he simply leave without publicly condemning him or taking his throne for good? This divine hesitation, this calculated mercy, was what gnawed at him the most. He couldn't understand if it was a sign of forgiveness, which he didn't deserve, or a slower, more refined punishment, in which he would be forced to live with the weight of his near atrocity, the burden of uncertainty, of invisible surveillance was the most refined punishment that could have been imposed on his already fractured spirit. And the worst was that, after that day, Saul began to see the world through an even more distorted filter. The inanimate objects in the palace, previously just furniture, seemed to have acquired a silent consciousness. The pillars of the main hall, carved with scenes of past victories, now seemed to look at him with a mute judgment. He felt that the echoes of Samuel's voice were still impregnated in the heavy curtains, in the crimson carpets, ready to whisper the word traitor at any moment of carelessness. The luxury of power turned into an oppressive stage design. His paranoia, which was previously focused on people, now spread to the environment itself. He distrusted the shadows, the movement of the wind that swayed the torches in the corridors. It was as if the kingdom itself was in cahoots against him, and the prophet Samuel was the key to deciphering this cosmic conspiracy. He felt watched by everything, and this sensation of being the only madman in a world that suddenly became lucid was slowly suffocating him, transforming the palace into a labyrinth of mirrors where he only saw his own distorted face. The officers who had been in the room, those who had heard the execution order and then witnessed the silent confrontation with Samuel, were no longer the same. That day had been a reality check in court politics. They had seen the king in his most vulnerable and, at the same time, most dangerous form, and had witnessed absolute authority being bent by the strength of a single voice, that of the prophet. They didn't talk about the matter, but the complicity of silence hung over them, creating a strange and bitter camaraderie. When they met in the corridors or in the camp tents, they exchanged quick, loaded glances, a kind of secret code that said, "I know what you saw," and the king almost made us cross an irreversible line. Their loyalty to Saul, which was already fragile, crumbled, replaced by a pragmatic fear of those who know they are dealing with a madman. They continued following orders, yes, but now with a cold detachment, as if they were just playing a role, knowing that at any moment they themselves could be the next Abner in the crosshairs of royal paranoia. The reverence they felt for Samuel, however, grew, transforming him into a mystical figure, a true invisible protector of the kingdom against the king's own fury. While Saul's madness deepened and fear spread among the high command, Abner was living his life normally, with the oblivious simplicity of someone who has no skeletons in the closet. He was at home, after a long day of training, tending to the horses, perhaps having dinner with his family, completely unaware of the cosmic drama that had unfolded in the palace because of him. He had no prophetic dreams, nor did he feel an inexplicable shiver. For him, it was just another workday. And this normality of his, this unchanged routine, was what made the whole experience so bizarre and touching. The narrator realized that Abner was being protected not by armor, but by his innocence, by his genuine loyalty. It was as if destiny had tried to force a tragedy, but the intervention of wisdom had diverted it at the last second, letting the general's life continue its course like a river that bypassed a giant rock. He continued to be the strong and reliable general, the anchor of Israel, without knowing that his moral weight had been for one day the difference between peace and chaos. And he would never know how close the tip of the sword came to his neck, which, in a way, was the greatest blessing of all. From that day on, Saul's relationship with the prophet Samuel became something ghostly and frightening. The king no longer dared to seek Samuel, fearing the naked exposure of his soul that the old man's presence brought. He tried to justify to himself that the prophet was in seclusion, that he was too old, but deep down he knew he was fleeing the mirror Samuel offered him. Whenever he received a messenger from the prophet's region, Saul's stomach churned in a knot of anxiety. He felt the desperate need to prove he was king, that he still had divine favor, but with every attempt at self-affirmation, the image of Samuel standing at the door shattered his confidence. The king began to develop a strange superstition. He avoided mentioning Samuel's name aloud, as if the mere pronunciation could invoke the old man's judging presence. Samuel's authority now was not political, it was metaphysical, hovering over the palace like a silent guardian he could not bribe, arrest, or kill. And this attempt to ignore the voice of conscience only made Saul's solitude deepen in an almost physical way. He walked through the grand, cold halls, feeling the weight of every tile beneath his feet. And the palace, which was once the symbol of his power, now seemed like an echoing void. No one dared to approach too closely, not even his sons, who felt the father's heavy, unstable energy. He spent long hours gazing at the horizon, but he saw no landscapes. He only saw the elongated shadow of his own failure. The narrator could feel the king's raw pain, a pain that did not come from war wounds, but from self-imposed isolation, a separation from everything that was pure and true. He was the most powerful king in Israel, but he was, by far, the most needy and helpless. Man in the kingdom, condemned to reign in an echo chamber made of his own paranoia and the memory of that day when his vengeance was mysteriously paralyzed. The emotional burden Saul carried since that day began to manifest in strange physical symptoms, which he tried in vain to ignore or attribute to natural causes. He developed a constant migraine that throbbed in his temples, a dull ache that seemed to follow the rhythm of his unresolved guilt. He felt an uninterrupted pressure in his chest, as if an invisible hand were constantly squeezing him, making deep breathing difficult. The narrator saw that the king, once a strong and vigorous warrior, was now physically wasting away, losing his appetite and sleep, with deep, dark circles that looked like two emotional bruises. The court physicians, unaware of the prophetic confrontation and the revoked order, tried to treat him with herbs and balms, but the disease was in the soul, not the body, and the only cure would be the confession and peace he refused to seek. That day with Samuel had been more than a clash. It had been an open wound that never healed, corroding his health from within and transforming him into a haunted shadow of himself. To try to deal with Samuel's unexplained intervention, the way his fury was simply cut in half, Saul began to construct rational explanations for the event, as any human being would do to try to fit the bizarre into the commonplace. He tried to convince himself that Samuel had only acted out of fear of retaliation from the northern tribes, that the prophet was clever and calculating, and that there was nothing divine or mysterious in the act. He thought he was only protecting the kingdom from a political schism, not saving me from my sin. This attempt to mundanize the miracle was his only way to maintain his sanity and the rest of his pride. However, this hollow explanation was never enough. When he was alone, in the disturbing silence of the night, the chill in the courtyard and the look of absolute moral authority of the prophet returned, and he felt, with the raw certainty of his inner self, that it had been something beyond human, an intervention that challenged all his logic of power and left him terrified of what else might be watching him from above. General Abner, even without having the slightest idea of what had happened, began to notice Saul's glacial coldness and vague gaze. It was not the typical coldness of a busy king, but something denser, sicker. Saul communicated with him in hurried monosyllables, avoiding any prolonged eye contact, and this evasion hurt the general's loyalty. Abner, a man of war and action, did not understand the new heavy atmosphere that hung over the king. He thought that perhaps he had committed some unmentioned tactical error, or that the jealousy of David had somehow been transferred to him. This unexplained distance from the king caused him a silent anguish. He felt wronged and misunderstood. But his honor prevented him from openly questioning the monarch. He continued to serve with the same dedication as always, but carried the weight of the undeserved royal disapproval without knowing that his life had been saved not by this dedication, but by a divine fear the king felt, and that his pure loyalty was what kept him, ironically, in the crosshairs of paranoid hatred. Meanwhile, the old Samuel returned to his reclusive routine with an austere satisfaction, that of one who had done what was necessary, but without joy. He did not stay in the palace to see the consequences of his intervention, for he knew that the work was not his, but of the force of truth he represented. Sitting in his simple home, he felt the distant relief of one who averted a disaster that would have cost Israel dearly. For the prophet, that day was not a spectacular miracle. It was merely the fulfillment of his bitter obligation to be the voice of conscience for a king who had lost his way. He had planted the seed of fear in Saul's heart, the fear of something greater than earthly power, and knew that this fear, although incapable of curing the king, would be enough to restrain his hand in the most crucial moments. The prophet did not boast. He merely sighed, knowing that although he had prevented the tragedy of that day, King Saul's final downfall was only a matter of time and his own choices. The mission was accomplished, and the only proof was Abner's intact life, a fact he never needed to confirm. The most surprising thing about the whole situation is how life in the palace, after Samuel's intervention, managed to readjust to a new and strange normal. The tragedy was aborted, but the trauma remained, hidden beneath the routine of banquets and duties. It was as if the court were a large orchestra that, in the middle of a dramatic symphony, had been forced into a momentary pause by an invisible conductor and now returned to playing, but with every musician tense and looking suspiciously at their neighbor. No one spoke about the revoked order, but the story was written between the lines of every interaction. Saul's paranoia did not lessen. It only became more sophisticated and secret, operating in the shadows. The servants walked on tiptoe, the counselors weighed every word, and the absence of an imminent disaster was the only proof that something extraordinary had occurred. The palace, in its stone grandeur, held the secret of a king who had been humiliated by his own soul and prevented by a force that defied the crown. And for those who look from afar like us, the feeling is one of deep wonder. It's the kind of story that makes us stop and think about the invisible lines that govern life, about how sometimes the most crucial intervention is not thunder in the sky, but the whisper of a conscience brought by someone who has the courage to speak the truth. The fact that Abner continued his life without even a shiver, unaware that his very existence was suspended and returned in a single day, makes the event incredibly human and bizarre at the same time. It is proof that life is full of unrecognized miracles, of disasters that were diverted at the last second by an appeal to ethics and justice. That day was the materialization of the phrase, "a deliverance occurred," a singular experience that teaches that not all power can silence the voice of moral authority when it decides to stand up against the blind impulse of vengeance. Until the end of his days, Saul never managed to shake off the impact of that single day. He tried, for years, to nullify the event, to pretend that the order had never been given or that Samuel had only appeared by chance. But whenever night fell and the silence of the palace was complete, he returned to the vivid memory of that confrontation. He remembered the cold light entering through the crack in the door, the prophet's grave voice, and especially the paralyzing chill that prevented him From speaking, he never again had the same brutal certainty in his decisions for vengeance. Hesitation, the fear of being watched by something superior, became his trademark. That day did not cure his paranoia, but it complicated it, made it more painful and internal. It was as if Saul's conscience had been forcefully awakened, only to show him the darkness he lived in, without, however, giving him the strength to leave it. He remained, until the end, a man haunted by the absence of a tragedy he himself had planned, living with the certainty that something beyond his crown had stopped him. And what remains for us, observing this story, is the bittersweet taste of mystery. Abner went on with his life. The kingdom continued its march, and Saul continued his decline, but the event was never explained. There were no miracles in the sky, no thunder, only the unwavering authority of an old man who arrived at the exact moment and spoke the truth. This is the most emblematic outcome of all. And things simply stopped just as it started, and the protagonist, King Saul, could never put a name to the power that restrained him. Was it divine justice? Was it human fear? Was it prophetic wisdom? Whatever it was, it remained a question mark in his history, a unique and profoundly believable experience that only he, the paranoid king, lived through. And this lack of explanation is what makes the account so real, so similar to those bizarre things that happen in our lives that we tell a friend, saying, "Man, it just happened and I can't explain it to this day."